From Richard Branson to The Exorcist, bribes with George Harrison's Bentley, a pep talk from Rolling Stones guitarist Mick Taylor, and about 1,000 re-releases, one of these even for the Commodore 64 game console. Mike Oldfield's debut album Tubular Bells has everything to make up a great story for a special episode of Retro Reviews. So, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of such an interesting album, I present to you this Retro Review. Hi people, and hello my Chili Con Carnage crew, it's Chili here from Live Listen Erased, and on this episode we're going to focus on Mike Oldfield's debut album, Tubular Bells, released in 1973. Mike Oldfield might not be a household name, unless you are a fan of early prog rock, but I can guarantee even if you haven't heard of the name, you would know of his material. Over his 50-plus year career, he has released 26 studio albums, but his most iconic work to date is from his debut album, Tubular Bells. If you have watched The Exorcist, then you have listened to Mike Oldfield. That's right, the theme for The Exorcist was written by none other than Mike Oldfield. Hell, even if you haven't watched The Exorcist, then you probably know it as that Halloween music. See, Mike Oldfield's music is synonymous to a scary sound, and every time around about Halloween period pops up, his music does as well. But what you are listening to is merely one small segment of a larger piece. In fact, the Tubular Bells piece in its entirety is over 40 minutes in length, and almost all of the instruments on the album were performed by Mike Oldfield himself. It's quite the feat considering he was only about 20 at the time of its release, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. Let's talk a bit about the history of the artist. Mike Oldfield was born in 1953, Michael Gordon Oldfield, and learned to play guitar from a very young age. In 1968, at age 15, he would end up writing music for his older sister Sally Oldfield from a tentative record that was overseen by Mick Jagger. But it's not known what eventuated from these recordings as they were lost to time. The duo would eventually form a folk group together called the Sally Angie, and released one album in 1969 called The Children of the Sun. The duo would split shortly after due to their limited success they received, and Sally would go on to become a singer, even featuring on various Mike Oldfield releases in the future. He would also briefly perform with a band called Barefoot with his brother Terry, before becoming a bass player for the band called The Whole World, featuring vocalist Kevin Ayers from Soft Machine, and would record music for the albums Shooting at the Moon, Whatever She Brings We Sings, and Edgar Broughton Band, released in 1970 and 1971 for the last two. All of the albums were recorded in the Abbey Road studios, and during downtime in the studio, Mike would write and perform on all kinds of instruments that were available to him in the studio. This would lead him to record a demo version for an album that he wanted to record, and one that would later become known as Tubular Bells. A tubular bell is an instrument that incorporates a set of metal pipes tubular in design, but giving off the sound of church bells. They have been around since around the 1850s, but Englishman John Harrington patented the bronze design sometime around the 1860s. They are also pretty tall, and some designs look very similar to a bellhop's luggage carriage, and would ultimately be used on this album. I mean, after all of the following records, I would hope so, otherwise that would be rather flaky. It's perhaps surprising to none that when Mike Oldfield recorded a 20-plus minute demo song, it was not met with much enthusiasm from the record labels. I mean, who wants to hear a 40-plus minute instrumental song from an unknown artist? Although, I must admit, it's kind of odd considering that the prog rock scene was kind of at its peak around this time. Pink Floyd and Yes were dominating the charts and putting out these outlandish records with extensively long tracks, so why wouldn't Mike's record make it? Regardless, it took one individual to take a gamble with Oldfield and sign him under their new record company. That person was Richard Branson, and he had started out his label, Virgin Records. After signing to a label, he set about recording at Manor House in 1972, even finishing part 1 in a week. The second half would be recorded over the upcoming months and into 1973. The record was originally going to be called Opus, which is rather befitting in hindsight, and simultaneously restricting of any future records he could release. Another working title suggested by Richard Branson himself was Breakfast in Bed, and the cover art would feature a boiled egg with blood pouring out of it. A similar album cover was used for Mike Oldfield's future album, Heaven's Open, released in 1991. The namesake of this album is due to the only lyrics that can be heard during the 40+ minute runtime, which introduces each instrument, and can be heard roughly 20 minutes into the first track, when the final instrument was called.
Tubular Bells.
It was with enough distinction that caused the record to be named after this particular instrument. There is also a joke that was made on the vinyl copy pressings of this, where the early vinyls would have a note on their sleeves stating, "This stereo record can be played on mono reproducers, provided either a compatible or stereo cartridge wired for mono is fitted. Recent equipment may already be fitted with a suitable cartridge. If in doubt, consult your dealer." On copies of Tubular Bells, this note was changed, so instead it would read the following: "This stereo record cannot be played on old tin boxes no matter what they are fitted with. If you are in possession of such equipment, please hand it in to the nearest police station." Quite good, eh? Even during the recording of the album, there was an outtake to be used on Sailor's hornpipe, which contained commentary by a not-so-sober Vivian Stanshall, which goes into detail about a tour of the manor they were recording at. Vivian talks about the manor having 483 rooms, each with their own marble wash basin and douche, before admiring the 17th century paintings, that when scratched off show 14th century artworks underneath them, before proclaiming, "He is buggered if we know why this style has made a resurgence in recent times."
Buggered if I know.
It's all very British and rather funny. This record would be Virgin's first ever release and was given the catalogue number V2001. Record sales were initially slow, but it took a chance meeting to change all of that. The story goes that William Friedkin, director of The Exorcist, had scrapped the initial score done by Lalo Schifrin and met with Amit Etugin, head of Atlantic Records, the US distributor of Tubular Bells, to talk about the movie. When he discovered the record and put it on, he knew from the start that this piece needed to be in his movie. The Exorcist was released in America in December 1973 and eventually in Europe several months later, and took the world by storm, drumming up massive media hype in Mike Oldfield, selling enough records to make his head spin around in circles. The legacy of this record was cemented after that, and it stayed in the charts in the UK for the next 5 years, eventually becoming number 1 in 1974. In total, it is estimated to have sold over 2 million copies in the UK alone, and around 15 to 17 million globally.
It became the theme tune from The Exorcist, and because of The Exorcist, it got propelled, worldwide to the top of the charts, and it stayed there for ages and ages.
Usually this part of the review gives a small insight into each track of the album, but as mentioned before, this album only has 2 tracks technically speaking, a bonus 1 or 2 songs if you are including a certain reissue versions. For this part I'm going to focus on the title track as well as the song Sailor's Hornpipe. Tubular Bells. Where to begin with this beast of a song? Well, simply put, despite it being a 2-parter track of 45+ minutes, it's more like a huge amount of segmented pieces that were put together with some finely tuned editing techniques and mostly seamless transitions. To perfectly showcase what I mean, I would suggest looking at the track listing for the 2003 version of Tubular Bells, which should be on screen about now. And as you can see, the segments are prominent for their reference of style or instruments used during their parts. You have the introduction piece, which is famously known as the Exorcist song, and is one of the longest segments on the record. Instruments are played sporadically throughout its runtime, such as the prominent guitar work in the fast guitar section, or the bagpipes heard in the second half during bagpipe guitars, or the bass playing during the surprise basses section. You have also various styles of music incorporated in the album, with blues to jazz to Latin. It's a lot to take in on your first playthrough, and rather unusual compared to other contemporaries around this time, whose musical works would also include various movements and time signature changes, not unlike Oldfield. But on this adventure, we see him pressing the boundaries of what could be played out with various instruments spread out over enough time. This is all brought to a head during the crescendo of the first half of the track as the music builds to its precipice in a rather perfect style. A bass line plays out during the conclusion before musical instruments are introduced one at a time in layers, like a tiered wedding cake, and we are eagerly awaiting that knife to cut through it, and show us each layer, like on some episode of The Bake Off. This was a passion project by Mike Oldfield, and it shows. The song really pushed the limits for music at the time, also being one of the first prominent instrumental albums to be released. Sailor's Hornpipe. When it comes to this bonus song, I wasn't aware of the commentary version. I chalked this up to the fact that I usually listen to the live recording I had of Mike Oldfield called Exposed, and if you are a fan of his works and haven't heard of this one, then I highly recommend it. The concert includes a live performance of Incantations as well as Tubular Bells, all in full, recorded in 1979, but it doesn't appear to be on Spotify or Apple Music, and I have tried looking. As for the song Sailor's Hornpipe, it's a weird little folk kind of tune. It has this weird jaunty parts and is kind of cool. It's an interesting piece, and the commentary, as I said, has been pretty funny on this part, so I dig the commentary section of it. I really do think it was a bit too quirky to be included on the original. It really does feel like it's worlds different compared to Tubular Bells, but I'm glad it's been included in hindsight. Overall, I would rate this at 13.5 million chilies on the spicy scale, and it would be redundant of me to state my favourite tracks, as there are only two. It's a pretty solid record overall, but it's not exactly a perfect run. At times it feels like a bunch of random segments just slapped together, and is more noticeable with additional playthroughs. It is also compounded by some of the transitions between those segments, which despite best efforts can come across as janky. The good news is that this is not the case for most of the album, as the rest of it can easily meld into that one giant piece. Fame can be a bitch, especially when you are constantly remembered for one piece of work and you have such a plethora of other records to offer. Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells is his most recognisable piece, and as such, he was typecast to a certain image. It is similar in vein, I guess, to Meatloaf with his Bat Out of Hell record, or Kiss and their Masks, or Nickelback and writing subpar music. Mike Oldfield eventually became idiosyncratic to those Tubular Bells, and with the success of his debut album, there were calls for a live performance to be done. Initially, Mike Oldfield rejected the idea, citing that the difficulties of the piece within all the instruments, as well as a lack of confidence in the material working in a live setting. Numerous musicians came forth to assist him on a one-off concert in June of 1973. To avoid Oldfield from pulling out from the concert, Richard Branson gave him his Rolls Royce, which he bought off George Harrison, under the condition he would go through with the show. Even on the night, his nerves did not settle, and Rolling Stone's Mick Taylor, who was performing alongside him that night, brought in Mick Jagger to give him some words of confidence that allowed him to at least step foot on the stage. The concert was well received and left Mike flabbergasted by its success. Despite numerous future albums of varying nature, styles and sounds, he would find himself returning to the Tubular Bells on 8 separate occasions, and it's a shame he could never outrun this shadow, because a lot of his works are really quite good. For example, he would write the music to the 1984 film Killing Fields, and its eclectic electric sounds really capture the tension in scenes during the movie and exemplifies it. I refer you to the song called Evacuation, with its uneasy and short chords played throughout, keeping a great layer of tension. Even his transition to more pop-orientated material in the 80s is something that I would recommend. In particular, the album Crises, which still has a 20-minute epic on side A, before going into more radio-friendly sounds, with guest vocalists ranging from Yes frontman John Anderson on the song In High Places, Roger Chapman on Shadow on the Wall, and Maggie Riley, who appeared on a few albums around this time, but in particular, I have to mention the song Moonlight Shadow, a song which many have suggested alludes to John Lennon's assassination. If you listen to the lyrics, they don't really correspond with the events of the night, but it's interesting to note that Mike Oldfield was staying a few blocks away from the location of John Lennon when he was killed, and he has stated the events of that terrible night may have had an influence on the writing of this song. Other notable works I would suggest include the songs of Distant Earth, Incantations, Omadorn, and Hergest Ridge. In fact, in an interesting twist of events, when Mike Oldfield released his second album, Hergest Ridge, in 1974, it would rise to the #1 spot on the UK albums charts and stay there for 3 weeks, only to be overtaken by Tubular Bells, and becoming one of only a few artists to overtake themselves in this manner. When we look over the Tubular Bells albums, there are some interesting efforts, and some that are less than stellar. A quick note here, but Tubular Bells has an appearance on the Commodore 64 system, and plays out in all that audio quality goodness that a Commodore 64 can pump out. Seriously, the program looks like a screensaver with 16-bit audio, as you can see here. This wouldn't be the last time either, with another Tubular Bells making an appearance as a music VR in 2004. I feel like the move to return to this theme after 20 years was the one that he intended to do a few years back, but due to tensions with him and his record label at the time, Virgin, he chose to refrain from doing so until he was in a better place. Back when Oldfield was recording his 12th record with Virgin, the label wanted to name the upcoming album to be called Tubular Bells 2, but Mike told them it was more like a follow-up to his 1976 album Omadorn. Eventually, the record would be called Amarok, and linear notes of the CD would contain a message stating, "Health warning. This record could be hazardous to the health of cloth-eared nincompoops. If you suffer from this condition, consult your doctor immediately." Another interesting note is the hidden message on this album, which is in Morse code around the 48-minute mark. The Morse code reads as following: EFF. OFF, RB, or simply put, fuck off Richard Branson, the owner of Virgin Records. In a follow-up on the next album he released, Heaven's Open, he would reprise this line on the song Music from the Balcony. Oldfield would return to Tubular Bells in 1992 under Warner Music UK, and is one mighty fine return to the Bells, even including a special appearance by the legendary Alan Rickman himself, who would introduce the musical instruments during the track The Bell.
And Tubular Bells.
This album would also be remixed and re-released in the same year before he returned to the Bells in 1998 for Tubular Bells 3, and again the year after for the Millennium Bell, and again in 2003 for a variant of the original album, only to have a deluxe edition emerge in 2009 containing demos and rough mixes, and again in 2013 for a remix edition of the original album, before we finally land in 2023 with the 50th anniversary remastered version of this album. I guess you could say ring the bell and count us out, because that's not so tubular after all these years. And this is before I mention the remasters of the original album, which, including this recent version, has seen 8 reissues. Look, I love Mike Oldfield and his works, but there's only so many times a person can be sold on Tubular Bells before it becomes a piss take. How many times do I need to buy this record if I want to hear it remastered in 5.1 surround sound, or with some demo versions included, or the outtake where Oldfield audibly farts during the jazz section? I have heard this new version, and sure, it sounds updated, but between Virgin and Mercury, this has been done to death, and it really undermines what should have been a monumental moment for the music and the musician. I just can't shake the notion that at its roots, it boils down to this.
Hello, I like money.
I don't know if Mike Oldfield has much say in the matter, but I don't exactly think he is pushing back too hard at his label to not do it either. It would take a madman to do so otherwise, and I can't really blame him for doing nothing. Earlier this year, Mike Oldfield did announce his retirement from music, so this might be it for the Tubular Bells series. Had this record been released 4 years later, I imagine it would have been mocked to death and sunk like a lead balloon due to the punk movement. I'm sure they did as much anyway, but given its release during the heyday of the progressive rock movement, it was well suited for at least a scrap of success. I still enjoy this record and consider it to be a timeless album, despite which rendition you choose to hear. But I guess to most, it will always be associated with that Exorcist theme song music. The good news for Mike Oldfield fans, or potential ones, is with the 50th anniversary release, a lot of other albums that were previously unavailable have been released to streaming services, including the records Incantation, Platinum, QE2, and his last record, Return to Omadorn. The last 3 of these I have yet to hear, so after this is done, you know what I'm going to be listening to. So if you are a fan of prog rock, pop rock, Celtic, new age, guitar instrumentals, or just looking for a new artist to hear, I recommend starting at this fine record. Thank you for checking out this episode of Retro Reviews. Make sure you leave a like if you can, subscribe to us, and as always people, you have a great day and stay spicy. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Live Listen Erased, and if you have enjoyed this episode, make sure you share it with all your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our Chili Con Carnage crew so you can get notified for all the future videos that we put out, as we put out videos every Friday. Also, we are on Discord, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter over at Live Listen Erased, so make sure to tune in over there. And don't forget to like this video so that our manager can stay very happy. This record could be hazardous to the health of cloth-eared nincompoops. If you suffer from this condition, consult your doctor immediately. Another interesting note,